Welcome to the Ultimate Ukraine channel. The war in Ukraine is concentrated in the Melitopol region in the south and the city of Bakhmut in the east. With the joint work of the Ukrainian armed forces and the partisans in the Ukrainian cities, the regions held by Russia continue to be liberated. The cold bite of winter aggravates the conditions of the Russian army. For a long time, the weariness of the war has fallen on the Russian soldiers. As you may remember, after the failure of the siege of Kiev, after Putin dismissed the Russian generals, serious conflicts began to take place within the Russian army. Most Russian troops began to revolt against the Kremlin and openly voiced their grievances. The Kremlin, ignoring these complaints, realized that it had left the Russian army to decay. The Russian army made many mistakes during the war. Do you remember? In the past months, we have witnessed that the Russian army accidentally shot its own troops many times and even clashed within itself. However, we are witnessing one of the biggest incompetence of the Russian army these days. Last week, Russian artillery hit their own troops with full accuracy. At least 20 soldiers from the Russian First Corps, that is, 1 or 2 detachments, were sleeping in their tents at night when they were targeted by Russian 120mm artillery shells and were eliminated from the front. This was just the beginning. The financial and military value of the fiascos has been gradually increasing. Russian air defense systems, which are very important from a strategic point of view, are being destroyed by their own hands. We already know that the Russian army could not stop the Ukrainian air force. The inadequacy of Russian air defense systems in Kherson and Crimea became obvious as a result of Ukrainian air attacks on Crimea. The easy destruction of 2 Russian S-400 systems in Kherson and dozens of S-300s by the Ukrainian air forces proved this. Ukraine's mock-up HIMARS also baited the Russians many times, and the Russians hit Ukraine's simple mock-ups with $13 million cruise missiles. At the top of these fiascos was the spectacular success of the Russian kamikaze drones for the sake of Ukraine. Today, the glorious Russian army shot down its S-300 missile with pinpoint accuracy with the Lancet kamikaze drone. Isn't that amazing? The support of the Russian army to the Ukrainian armed forces seems admirable. Let's examine the details of the event and ponder a little more. Russian state media reported that the S-300 PS surface-to-air missile of the Lancet Loafer ammunition hit the Ukrainian 5N-63S engagement radar. Russian media also shared a video that was widely circulated on social media, showing that the 5N-63S engagement radar was targeted and destroyed, reportedly using the Lancet kamikaze drone. Organizations monitoring the war in Ukraine pointed out that the vehicle, which appears to have been destroyed in the video, was missing critical parts such as power supply units and telescopic antenna, and based on this, the target was most likely a puppet. Ukraine Weapons Tracker took a slight step back against this claim by publishing another image of the 5N-63S engagement radar, indicating the presence of the 5S-17 power supply system, consisting of 2 generators. The vehicle was destroyed in the video released by the Russian media. We know that Ukrainian and Russian forces are conducting psychological and information warfare against each other by deploying models or mock-ups of weapon systems such as HIMARS and S-300 air defense systems. Such dummies are decoys to distract the enemy's surveillance and attack systems. A famous war analyst investigated this event in detail and published his conclusions based on the fact that the radar system destroyed in the video belonged to the Russian army. This also meant that it was a fake vehicle. It was not mistaken for a real target and was destroyed by Russian forces. Yet they shot the dummy and claimed that it was a genuine Ukrainian system for war propaganda. Considering the period in which the images were broadcast and the military positions, we can reach very serious findings that Russian ammunition was found in the region. Therefore, it is possible that the vehicle destroyed in the video carries a working radar system. However, they abandoned it as the Russian forces retreated and removed generators and a telescopic antenna, turning it into a puppet. In the image, he marked in green an object that, according to him, is the 5N-63S radar mast of the S-300 PS system, and behind it are 2 more objects with red markings, resembling transport ramps. The fact that the S-300s were in the region for a long time right after the attack also shows us a long time to be protected from the Ukrainians at that location. The Russian military's approach to this equipment sharply contradicts the security and camouflage measures that should be taken in an airspace filled with reconnaissance drones of Ukrainian artillery systems that can hit a target as soon as they are detected. Finally, all the facts were revealed when a photo was shared with the Z mark on the system that was hit clearly. The fact that the Russian army actually uses its own weapons seems like a big problem, because with the Ukraine war, hundreds of thousands of recruits were added to the Russian army. Russian soldiers go into battle with very little food, few bullets, and instructions from Wikipedia for weapons they barely know how to use. They are revealing their positions by talking on open phones. Russian soldiers reveal the incompetence and disorganization of the army ranks in these speeches. Russian soldiers are given unrealistic plans to take Ukrainian territory. They think that they are thrown into hell and left to die. Let's continue by examining these events from a much more internal Russian brigade. Troops from Russia's 155th Marine Corps Brigade, groping blindly through crater farms, said they had no maps, medical kit, or working radios. Just a few weeks ago, they were factory workers and truck drivers watching an endless spectacle of supposed Russian military victories at home on state television before their enlistment in September. One doctor in the brigade was a former barista with no medical training. Now they're piled on top of overcrowded armored cars, plowing through fallow fields with Kalashnikov rifles from half a century ago, saying there's almost nothing to eat. Russia has been at war most of the year, but its army seemed less prepared than usual. In interviews, brigade members said that some of them had barely fired before, and they said they had almost no shells anyway, let alone air cover or cannons. But it didn't frighten them too much, they said. Their commanders had promised they would never see war. As the bullets began to crash around them and shatter their comrades, they realized how badly they had been duped. A conscripted Russian soldier thrown to the ground remembered opening his eyes with a shock, the mutilated bodies of his comrades filling the field. Shrapnel had pierced his stomach too. He said he was desperately trying to dig a ditch with his hands by crawling into the thick trees to escape. Speaking on the phone from a military hospital outside Moscow, the soldier said that about 40 of the 60 members of his platoon were killed that day in late October, near the eastern Ukrainian town of Pavlivka. He said only 8 survived serious injuries. The soldier said that this was not a war, that the Russian soldiers were destroyed by their commanders. Do you realize how painful this is? Russian soldiers are now thought to have committed genocide against themselves and the Ukrainians at the same time. This is thought to be the main reason for the advance of the Russian army. Russian soldiers of different ethnicities are now convinced that they have been sent to the front in Ukraine to destroy themselves. President Vladimir Putin's war should never have been like this. When the head of the CIA went to Moscow last year to warn Ukraine against an invasion, Putin's national security advisor found an extremely confident Kremlin, while boasting that Russia's most advanced armed forces were strong enough to counter even the Americans. But looking back today, we realized that the self-confidence was completely unfounded. The Ukrainian war, above all, destroyed the Russian ego. Captured Russian invasion plans show the army running hundreds of miles across Ukraine, expecting victory within days. Officers were told to take their uniforms and medals with them in anticipation of military parades in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. But instead of this resounding victory, in which tens of thousands of his soldiers were killed and parts of his army fell apart after nearly 10 months of fighting, they were faced with something else entirely. The country's worst humanitarian and strategic disaster since the collapse of the Soviet Union is drawing nearer day by day. How did one of the most powerful armies in the world, led by a famous tactician like Putin, stagger so badly against a much smaller and weaker rival? We used hundreds of Russian government emails, documents, invasion plans, military logbooks, and propaganda directives to piece together the answer. We listened to Russian phone calls from the battlefield. As a result, what we see is that dictators, even a famous strategist like Vladimir Putin, are often captive to their egos and ambitions, and as a result of these ambitions, they can lead their country to disaster. Putin's aides said he was driven by self-aggrandizement and anti-Western fervor, which led him to the fateful decision to invade Ukraine, almost in complete isolation and without consulting experts who saw the war as pure stupidity. Now, this war shows us the darkness that his ambitions have put Russia in. Even if the Russian people can make some moves to determine their own destiny, Putin is still strong politically. But if the Russian army loses, and Putin's final offensive fails, his throne may be destroyed. Thanks for watching.